Hey, everybody, it's Professor Reed. Got a little lecture here on the 7 types of evidence. Now, I would say this, not really the most groundbreaking type of lecture, nor is it something that, is going to really, I don't think is going to stress you out in terms of writing. But if you ever played a sport, like when I was a kid, I played football, there was blocking and tackling. It's just the basics of what you'll want to do. So, the way they sort of conceive of this or think about it is if you can go back to these 7 types of evidence as you write a paper, you should be pretty successful as you put together the information in a paper. So, conspiracy theories that we're going to look at, they're going to be, sometimes complicated to unpack. If you can look at these 7 types of evidence, especially in an argumentative paper, it's going to give you a little bit of guidance in terms of like organization. And also, I think the key thing is you want to also think about the paper in terms of how you're going to develop it, and it gives the reader a little bit of variety in terms of what the presentation of the paper is and how they can sort of break down the information you're presenting. So if you've ever gotten to an argument with anybody, we don't want to go too much into that. Significant other, what have you. I have kids. Sometimes we argue. Like you'll want to think about these 7 types of evidence because I think a lot of times in a 15 101 type of class, students can sort of like go through the class and go, what's really relevant here. I think this is something that is relevant to the writing process, and it's pretty relevant to life in general, as I do logical fallacies. Okay, so these 7 types of evidence, you want to think about sort of layering these as you write. I'm going to post an article to read. It's a little bit older article that will talk about the 7 types of evidence, but you want to think about sort of mixing these into a paper. And like I said, in addition, if you get into arguments across the board, which you probably shouldn't be doing so much, haphazardly, but if you do, um, think about these different types of evidence. Okay, we'll go to the next slide here. All right, good. Now, what I want you to do is just sort of play a little game with me. Think about, I want to, couple of seconds here, but I've been teaching across the board about 10 years, and I used to give students the option of like writing about whatever paper they want for this theme, and I would get some pretty classic themes for a paper. Okay, so just take a second and sort of think about those essays you may have written in high school. What were the themes of those essays? Like a good solid 5 paragraph argumentative paper. All right, so that's a couple seconds. Okay, so like the top 3 essays, and this has sort of changed over time. I've gotten a lot of papers on gun control, and it's pretty amazing. Over the last couple of years, I've had a lot of papers on concussions in sports. Student athletes like to write about that. It's got a little bit of media attention. I get, obviously papers about social media. I find students who write papers on saying, social media, sort of the dangers of it are usually some of the students that are in class are actually like pretty addicted to their phones. I know addicted is a heavy term, but they're pretty into their phones. Okay, but what I want to do is talk about, this is like the idea of like the classic 5 paragraph essay. What are the top 3 essays I would get out of 100? So I would say, like abortion's pretty high. That's always a controversial subject matter. Gun control has been pretty high. Social media is actually pretty high as well. And like I said, recently I've seen an uptick in concussions in sports. But the top one that I'm going to get, I'm going to flip the page here. It's going to be marijuana legalization. Okay, so now that's a little graphic there from The Simpsons. Why this is sort of relevant. Um, I'm not promoting marijuana usage. I think it's pretty destructive. But we're looking at a cross section of papers. Let's say 100 papers. I could usually then this is when students can write about anything they want. I'll usually get about 10 to 15 papers on legalization of weed, right? So the weed paper, I'm like a little expert in marijuana because I've read a lot of papers on it. It's good or bad. We can sort of take that. Now, the point of this is, if you could really break this down, say I get roughly 10 papers on marijuana legalization. Typically, 8 of those are going to be um, probably in the C level, like a C paper, and we have responsibilities. We have parents that are, helping us out with college. We have goals and aspirations. And a C is probably something that you don't want to get. Obviously, an F paper is going to be something that nobody wants. Now, I've got theories about this. Probably um, the fact that people that write the legalization of marijuana paper are also probably pro that position. I would say out of 10 papers, I've seen maybe three, well, like 10 papers a semester. I've probably seen three that were against the legalization of marijuana. And I think some of those papers, like were written before marijuana became such sort of a hot button type of discussion. Okay, so now the reason to focus on this is that, not to make a judgment about legalization of marijuana, um, but but really to look at it as in terms of a paper that can be sort of unsuccessful in terms of this idea of 7 types of evidence. Now, that being said, about those C papers, I have had very memorable papers that were A papers about legalization of marijuana. One of the things I try to stress is that I don't make judgments about the subject matter of the paper. We're really trying to take the idea of the truth and sort of take it out of there. But I've had papers that have been about, taxation of marijuana or some of the punitive. There's people sitting in jail right now in the country for marijuana possession that's sort of shocking. So I have had papers that have been really well done about legalization of marijuana, and with it being legalized in certain states, I know Colorado and Washington, a lot of statistics and data has come out of those states that have been pretty verifiable, and students have woven them into the paper. So, you know, um, the theme of the class is conspiracies. Now, like I say, there's a conspiracy of everything. Some people believe there is sort of this idea of big pharma keeping marijuana legalization out of it. So it's not to say you couldn't have a paper about that. But for this is really looking at the idea of a paper I've seen a lot of that sort of lacks in this idea of 7 types of evidence, and I think the papers that have been really well done about this subject matter have been successful because they reference these 7 types of evidence. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. All right, good. So our first, you know, type of evidence is going to be factual information. So think about this: like you get in an argument or you write a paper that's argumentative. You want to give some factual information. Okay, so we'll refer back to that marijuana paper. Um, facts about marijuana could be levels of addiction, or it could be, percentage, how much marijuana is grown in the country, right? So, like we're going to reference marijuana paper as a point of discussion, but also with the conspiracy theory paper, if you're going to argue about, facts about um, JFK assassination, the day it happened, these are going to be things you can put in a paper to get some common agreement. Okay, so like whatever argument you get in, if you argue with somebody about a sports team, you argue with something, factual information could be something you can get some agreement with. Now, we don't want to an argumentative paper have just a statement of fact. We want to try to weave in different angles to the paper. Okay, so this is, think about it sort of like you've got a quiver of arrows and you're trying to um, gain commitment from the reader and convince them of your point of view. Okay, so factual information is going to help you ground the reader. Okay, And you think about it, you can add in factual information throughout the paper, and then the idea is you're going to take these 7 types of evidence and put them into the paper. And a good piece of writing is a form of art, but like, you've got choices to make as a writer, and to be really cognitive and aware of these is going to help you, like, convince some people. And maybe if you don't convince them, you can also show that you're sort of a moral person as well. And we'll talk about that ethos, pathos, and logos type of idea as well. So factual information is something you can put into the paper. All right, good. Now the next thing is going to be professional testimony. So you can also sort of think about this too as well. I don't know if we have any pre-law students, but professional testimony is going to be something that you can add into the paper to give the paper points of reference. Okay, so there's nothing like having an argument with somebody and they rely a little bit too much on their personal opinion. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. We don't, we want to have a paper that maybe brings in something into the paper that's personal, but we don't want to have this as some sort of experience of your own journey in something. Okay, so professional testimony is going to be something that's from an expert, that's going to, quantify, back up the information. All right, good. Now, I got a picture of Dr. Phil there. Been a couple years. There he is, Dr. Phil. Now, one of the things to do, you want to also check your experts. I've had a few papers that, student was writing about sociological subject, and they quoted somebody who was a computer science. Not to say the two individuals aren't that smart comparatively, but you want to check your experts in the field. Now, in the conspiracy theory world, this is where this gets pretty interesting and pretty challenging for like a librarian, because individual A and individual B may have different types of backgrounds, and they may have sort of differing opinions about a certain subject matter. Okay, so expertise in a field in terms of who's an expert in it is something that we will explore in conspiracy theories. Okay, and what you want to think about is also trying to create a level of irony in your paper. you know an expert in the field, that maybe has a differing point than your paper, than the thesis of your paper, could be something you could sort of use. You could sort of use the quote from the individual in an ironic way. Okay, so we'll talk about that. Look at some examples of that. Recently, over the last couple years, there's been some conspiracies that have been proven to be true that most people wouldn't have agreed on, right? So, like, it's come out that Facebook had some connections to different types of organizations that ended up doing a heavy amount of spying. There was the Edward Snowden, I guess we call it revelation, where he basically said, you know what, like, NSA has access to your information. So what counts as a professional testimony, in this sort of discussion about conspiracies is pretty interesting. So think about this: if you're writing about a conspiracy and you're writing about like a paper where you have to argue if you believe it or not, if you can use an expert in that subject matter, it's going to help give your paper like a veracity to it. Another example is in the JFK assassinations. A lot of students write about that. I get students that are pretty into that, or they, but they'll quote somebody who is an expert in military types of weaponry, right? Because there's the idea that like Lee Oswald basically, like he used a certain type of rifle. I don't want to get too much into it, but that's pretty interesting to see from a professional testimony standpoint. Somebody that has a little bit of disagreement. Okay, and the reason for Dr. Phil there is, not to put him down or anything, but he basically check your experts. Okay, and like I said, we'll have a library review, but you definitely want to, as part of the rubric for your first paper, you want to add in some sort of expert into it. Okay. All right, good. The next one's going to be a personal story. It's also called the anecdote. So, um, obviously we'll go back to the weed paper, and maybe I should have mentioned, professional testimony, and those some of the papers that are the A-level weed papers. They're gonna have, some sort of expert in the, maybe a psychologist or somebody that, you know has some sort of credentials. Okay, and we don't want to trust experts and things, right? Like we don't want to have like sort of a blind allegiance, but adding something into that is going to be helpful. Now, on the other side of that, you have the anecdotal story, the personal story. So, weed paper again. Gosh, talking a lot about this, but it's the way it goes. In the weed paper, you want to have, sometimes students will put in something personal. Like I had a student that read about, I want to say an uncle, or maybe it was his dad, had been a construction worker and had got an injury and then ended up addicted to opioids, which we know is a pretty big crisis in the United States, and it's sort of interesting because that becomes a conspiracy as well. But the story was that his, I want to say his uncle ended up weaning himself off of opioids, via marijuana. Okay, so if you have that anecdotal story to put in there, weave it in. You know, this is conspiracy theory papers. I don't know how many of us have, interactions with the CIA, right? There's a few that do, but I've had students that have written about, a variety of different things. Um, I've had a student that actually, this is sort of crazy, but this is a couple years ago. She actually, her dad worked on in, the Twin Towers in 9/11, and she, ended up playing sick from school that day, and her dad didn't go in, and she just added it into a 9/11 paper. Obviously, we don't want the whole paper to be about, your own personal experience, but if you can add in an element to that, it gives it a little bit of pathos, which is going to be emotion, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, a really good example of this in a conspiracy type of paper is going to be, the flu shot, right? Like, I've had a fair amount of papers on anti-vaccination, which, I will say I've read almost a little bit too many papers. I had a semester where, like, I had way too many papers on anti-vaccination, but it's fascinating subject matter, especially with COVID and the potential for a vaccine. But I had a few students who said, you know what, I don't get the flu shot, and so they added that into the paper, and it gave the paper a context to it. Okay, so if you add something personal to a paper, it's gonna give it a side that's a little bit more emotional. Now, we obviously don't want to have the whole paper about our own personal experience, but think about this. If you, like I said in the beginning, you're gonna argue with people in life, put something personal in there. Like that always helps out. So the idea of this is you're going to layer these elements together in order to, put a paper into, sort of this artistic place where it's multiple layers to it. And think about this also in terms of a court of law. You would want to have a personal story if you were a lawyer defending somebody for whatever crime. You're going to have professional testimony. You're going to have factual information about the person's life, and you're also going to have a personal story there. It gives it an element. However, we want to keep this all in balance. Okay, so if you ever call somebody anecdotal, you're basically saying, oh, you're taking something that is, personal you went through, and you're applying it to a situation in life, and it's not warranted. Okay. All right, good. The next one here is going to be data. Okay, and that's Spock from Star Trek. I don't know how fun he would be to hang out on the weekends. And somebody in one of my classes said that Star Trek, the second version, the guy that plays Spock is actually called Data. I had no idea, but I didn't add that in there. Anyways, long story short is data is going to be hard numerical pieces of information, but be aware of the tone that data causes. Okay, so like think about, we'll go back to the marijuana paper. Like there's data that comes out about marijuana usage. Okay, so and what's cool about that, or interesting, is that, as more legalization happens, the people argue, oh, we're getting authentic type of information. Whatever you read about, data is going to be something you want to put into the paper. Okay, so statistical hard pieces of information. Now, obviously, you don't want to put in the whole paper being about data, and you probably don't want to start the paper off with just hitting somebody with data across the board, right? Like data's got to be sort of explained. Okay, so think about if you read a paper about um, whatever piece of like say you're writing about opioid addiction, right? There's hard data about that that talks about the increased amount of people that have become addicted to some very dangerous type of drugs. If you can connect that to a personal story, or like something that's a little bit more pathos oriented, you're going to make the data real. So you want to take the time to explain the data. In addition, data is going to be something you can put into the paper and explain maybe how it's wrong or how it doesn't really cover something. Okay, so in the conspiracy world, there's a ton of data that could support something. Now, I had a paper a few years ago. I had two students back in spring 2019 that did two very different papers on this idea that Pearl Harbor in World War II, if you're familiar with the history of World War II, was basically the United States turned a blind eye to get us into the war, and they looked at data and used it very differently. Okay, so data should be explained. It creates a certain type of tone. Like I said, with Spock there, probably not somebody I want to hang out with on the weekends, necessarily, but like we said, you're trying to blend this information together in order to create a pretty interesting combination. And here's just some data about stocks. I played a little bit of baseball in my life. My kids play softball and baseball. Very data driven sport. Some people would argue almost too data driven with the shifts that are occurring and that sort of thing. But just think about it like the pure data on a player, especially in a sport like baseball, doesn't give the whole story. You gotta sort of explain it. Okay. So once again, just to reiterate, we're trying to combine these different types of um, platforms for information, and we're trying to mix those together in a paper. If you can do this well throughout a 5-page paper, and you can do your MLA citation, you can do, like topic sentences, thesis statement, you should be pretty successful. Okay. All right, good. Now the next one's going to be an example. Okay, and it's just going to help to build your case. So you think about it. If we'll go back to the weed paper once again, the weed paper, right? If you had an example maybe of somebody that's spending life in prison because of a 3-strike policy, because of certain possession of marijuana, and then you compared that to somebody that's a criminal for some other heinous type of crime, you can get some support for your position. So examples are going to be something you can add into the paper to give uh, like emotional connection to it. Like I said before, I've got a fair amount of papers on abortion, right? A very controversial type of subject matter, but they've given examples of somebody that had an abortion that ended up being successful, what have you, and it's ended up adding a little bit of realistic elements to the paper, like a realistic element to it. So once again, if you had a piece of data and you gave an example of it, you can show how the example doesn't fit the data, or you can show that the example is sort of an outlier, or it's a very good representation of it, right? In the conspiracy theory world, you get a fair amount of examples that happen in real life, and you can put them in there. So like, examples of a conspiracy could be something, like look at 9/11, and some people have said, oh, there's other types of activity the United States government did. It's very similar to 9/11, and they use that as sort of an example to back up their position. Okay, so when we talk about ethos, pathos, and logos at the end of this lecture, it's sort of trying to combine those ideas. You're basically trying to add in an example to give a little bit of emotion to the paper across the board. All right, good. Now the next one's going to be an analogy. Um, yeah, an analogy is a comparison between two things on the surface that don't seem alike. However, the writer is making a connection. You can see, it's good old Forrest Gump. I actually, you know, don't like Forrest Gump for multiple reasons. I don't really want to get into it. People get sort of mad at me, but feel like he's sort of abused. But anyhow, there's Forrest Gump. So he says, he's sitting on the bench there, right? Life's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get, which actually is considered to be something called the Mandela effect, which is a nice conspiracy you could write about. But an analogy is when you compare two things on the surface that don't seem alike. Okay, so let's go back to that sort of court of law type of idea. Um, you know, if you came to a court of law, they may try to show an analogy of something that is similar or not so similar to what you did and try to make some connections there. Okay, so analogies trying to compare two things on the surface don't seem alike. Now, in the history of my teaching, I've had some controversial moments. I had a student once that actually compared. Let's see if I can. It was about abortion. We having this debate, and they compared a fetus to uh, a parasite. And everybody in the class was like, "Whoa, it's like, what do you mean?" But the student's trying to say basically that the parasite lives off the body of the host, and then the baby lives off the body. Okay, so not to get too deep into that right now, first lecture, that sort of thing, but it was making a comparison between two things that on the surface don't seem alike, but the writer's trying to make a connection. I had a student once that was writing about education, and they basically said, our education system is like a skyscraper. If two levels of it don't function, then the whole thing will fall apart. Right? So, I have kids. They're great. A couple years ago, my son's math grade wasn't that good, and I was like, oh, like like trying to make a comparison here. I said, your grade is like he got like a gosh, hard time. He got like an A, but he on a math quiz, but he had like a D in the class. And I was like, well, that's sort of like I did a sports analogy. That's like comparing, like a touchdown in the fourth quarter when we're down by two touchdowns. Okay, so like I made an analogy there, and my kids do it back to me about my mustache or what have you. Okay, so analogies making taking two different ideas and make a comparison, and it's something you can use in the paper. Now, a pretty straightforward analogy from the marijuana world is looking at prohibition of alcohol back in the what was that, the 20s, and comparing it to prohibition of marijuana. Some people say, well, that's not, both weren't successful. Okay, that's a good analogy. It's gonna move the argument forward. It's a way of keeping these seven types of evidence. And when you get the rubric for the first paper, you're gonna see that like we're basically gonna make you sort of force you to get a good grade. You want five of these different types of evidence. Most students will stay away from an analogy. It's a little bit more complicated, but done correctly, it can be pretty powerful. Okay, and that's just a little Venn diagram. Oh my god, you're in college when you see a Venn diagram, but like basically idea A, idea B, and then where they coalesce in the middle here is going to be the analogy. All right, good. And then the last type of evidence is going to be hypothetical. And, you know, hypothetical is when you answer the what if question of the essay. If you have a thesis statement that argues a position, it's like, what if this is true? So if you're arguing about, a paper about legalization of marijuana across the board, you're going to say, okay, I've basically proven this to be true. What if we implemented these policies? How would this change things? And what's the pro, like ask for the argument, like ask for buyback from the reader that you've made this argument and you've presented the information. If like if you ever bought a car or you've been in sales or that sort of thing, it's like asking for the close of the essay. Okay, and it's when you're putting the information together. Now we will also look at an essay. It's a little bit older, but it will be about education in the United States, and it's basically has little hypotheticals throughout the paper. Okay, so a lot of times what students will do is they'll put together a paper, and they like they don't have this hypothetical to the very end. Well, we're gonna try to like look at this and splice this together throughout the paper. Think about court of law. If you went into a court of law, then you would want to make reference to the fact that your client is not guilty or guilty throughout the court proceeding. So hypothetical is asking for buy-in. What if this was true? What if this information I presented is true? What about what changes could we make? It's about sort of closing the argument, and there's going to be transitional phrases that we're going to use, which we'll have a whole lecture on. Transitional phrases are great. You definitely know it's a college level paper by using transitions, but at the same time, it's going to be something that can be a little bit overdone as well. Okay, so like I said, you're trying to take these 7 types of evidence and you're trying to layer them in the paper. You're trying to make them so that the reader can understand your position, and you're coming at it from different types of rhetorical points of view. So in a paper about controversial conspiracy theory, try to blend these together. And like I said in the beginning, if you get into arguments with people, this is probably something that you can add into an argument. If you get into an argument with somebody and you're being moral about it, you're not just trying to argue. Maybe ask them for an example, or if you're presenting your argument, give an example of it. Give a hypothetical. Give some sort of foothold for the reader or the person you're arguing with to have a little bit of your opinion about it. Okay, and the hypothetical is one that students usually think of as the last. It's sort of a recommendation in the paper, but it should also happen throughout the paper. And if you think about this, it's probably good to start off with something in the paper that's a little bit more emotional based, and then you get into the facts, you get into the data, and then you return back to this hypothetical at the end. I wouldn't really recommend starting a paper off with factual information. It's a little bit overwhelming. Okay. Okay, good. Now, this is sort of an overwhelming thing I got from the internet, but it's basically Aristotle's uh, idea of ethos, pathos, and logos, which I think probably most of you have experienced in high school. My kids actually listen junior high, so I don't want to go through this too much, but just sort of keep this in mind: ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. He was taught by Plato. I want to say Aristotle also taught Alexander the Great. Aristotle was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates. Okay, so ethos, pathos, and logos. This is a big, overview from the internet. I always make a joke about somebody getting this tattooed, maybe a full back tattoo with this, right? Don't do that. You don't want tattoos coming out of class. But like this is something you can sort of look at. It gives a pretty good overview. I will say that the next slide is much more straightforward. Okay, so here it is. Sort of thinking about this, and once again, another thing about your daily life, but this sort of comes out of that discussion of 7 types of evidence. Ethos is going to be creating moral character. So Aristotle, I'm not an expert on him. I'm sort of not an expert on anything really, but Aristotle created this idea of having moral character. So like you want to persuade an audience that you have a good character. Check your sources. You're looking at conspiracy theories. If you don't want to have sources that come out of one sector of the internet, try to blend these together, right? And we'll talk about that. If you can have an academic source and then blend in something about a conspiracy source, it'll give you a little bit more leverage as you write something. But check your source material. Also, watch out for your wording. We don't want to say anything condescending about the other side. We don't want to say something that is just trying to be spiteful about the other side. So word choice is going to be something that is going to keep you sort of ethical, and being aware and maybe describing the other side of the argument, if you believe in it or don't believe in it, is going to be something you can do to sort of beef up the paper and also give it this ethos or ethical point of view. Okay. Pathos is going to be something that's going to be where you add in some emotions into the paper. You're going to make the reader start to feel rather than just think. So think about it. The anecdote, the example is going to be something that's going to be emotional, right? It's very hard to be, very opinionated if you see something that is going to be an example from somebody's life. So if you had a paper about marijuana legalization, somebody objected to it for the right reasons, but they heard about how somebody maybe had an illness and they used medical marijuana, it may soften their position. They may start to believe your position. So pathos is going to be when you create an emotional connection to the reader. And this is also something to think about in terms of audience. Your different types of audience are going to be different type of emotional connections to it, right? So, these papers are going to be theoretically for anybody on campus. You could hand them to anybody on campus. You should basically be able to understand that. So just be aware of your audience as well. And then logos is going to be the reason part of the paper, how you organize it. We'll talk about logical fallacies throughout the class. That's going to be something you want to put in the paper. Staying logical. The biggest thing with this is really following from the thesis statement. I think we don't want to browbeat you with the thesis statement, but that's going to be something to just be aware of. Like, think about the way the information flows from the thesis statement. A lot of times you'll get into an argument with somebody, and the next thing you know is like, what the hell are we talking about, right? Like, we've gone so far from the core idea of the paper that we now no longer have the actual content of the paper. Okay, so think about that. That's going to be something that you want to balance out in the paper. And these are very connected to these different types of evidence. And like I said, for the umpteenth time, these are going to be things that if you can add into your just general living, if you're argumentative type person, you pride yourself on that. There's people that pride themselves on that. That's going to be something that you want to be aware of and try to blend into the paper as well. Okay, so ethos, pathos, and logos is going to be elements of the paper, and they're very connected to the 7 types of evidence. It's really looking at, like I said in the beginning, blocking and tackling in football, mechanics in baseball, uh, rudimentary type of, if you learn an instrument, how to, my daughter's taking drum lessons, how to hold the drumstick, right? It's a very basic type of ideas that are going to be allow you to get to the point of writing some complicated types of papers. Okay, so ethos, pathos, and logos goes hand in hand with the 7 types of evidence, and that's sort of it. I think that's a pretty good overview, and that's going to be the lecture there. I'll post some videos, but just you'll want to start thinking about these, especially to go to write, because a lot of times students have writer's block. I'm sure we all have had writer's block. Thinking about this will help you out with that. If you think about, oh, I need to add in an element of ethos, or I need to add in an element that's more emotional based, it's going to give you some options in terms of the paper. All right. So yeah, that's it.